All right. Hi, guys. I guess good to see you again. Mr. Upward and I should be kind of splitting the duties for the rest of the school year. So we'll be kind of alternating here every so often. But these are your videos for this week's reading. 3-1, 3-3 and 3-4. However, remember, all your terms are going to come from 3-3 because 3-4, surprisingly, is the final chapter of the unit. Which I know you guys are probably like, oh my God, like Unit 1 and Unit 1 was so long. There's only 4 chapters for Unit 3. Unit 4 is a little bit more long, and I think they're just as complex. It's just, it's not as broad. Everything's more interconnected now. So this final kind of content-focused chapter of Unit 3 is going to focus on belief systems. And I don't think it's like, it's a place, the topics that are included in this unit are kind of like homeless topics. They don't fit really cleanly, I think, perfectly into what we talk about with Unit 3, generally with the land-based empires, nor do they fit really into Unit 4, which talks about maritime empires and things like that. But nonetheless, these are really important events to talk about because they really set up the fabric of Unit 5 and 6. Here's our vocab. It's pretty dense because this is the only one you have. So I think there's 27 different terms and stuff like that. So just pause me while you watch that, while you record this, and move to the next slide now. Pause me again. And finally, pause me one last time. So, actually, there's something I did want to double check before I started. So I'm going to pause the recording for a second. All right, so let's get into this. The big event we need to talk about is the Protestant Reformation. So if you recall from Unit 1.6, I was really relatively critical of how Eurocentric AMSCO seems to be, and Unit 3.3, Chapter 3.3 is another example of that. This is a lot of European history. There are things that are happening to the religions of the Gunpowder empires and of the Qing dynasty are impacting far more people, and the Mughals are impacting far more people. But AMSCO has determined that these are the exemplars. We could teach you those things, but AMSCO would decide to focus on this stuff. So when you think Protestant, I think it's really helpful to break down the kind of root words for Protestant and Reformation. So as you can probably imagine, protest, reform, okay? The initial intent of the Protestant Reformation was not to develop new sects of Christianity that were distinguishable from Catholicism. They were, in fact, intended to change Catholicism. In fact, if you are a practicing Lutheran or you've ever visited a Lutheran church, you would actually be seeing something that was very similar to a Catholic Mass. How a service is done in the Lutheran Church is very similar to a Catholic Mass, and Lutheranism being the one most attached to Martin Luther. Of course, there's differences, and Catholicism has become more and more, what do you call it, vernacular over the past century. So they've become closer and closer as time has gone on. There are still some pretty big things about the approach of the papacy between Lutherans and Catholics. Okay, so if you recall from 1.6, the big theme here in that chapter about the Catholic Church was it was the unitary cultural institution of Europe, which meant that in Western Europe and in Central Europe, you were either Catholic or you weren't, and you were socially ostracized, right? Where that's including Jewish people, Muslim people that made up a significant minority of the population, not significant, I'd say a minority of the population. And even if you didn't adhere to all the tenets of Catholicism, you called yourself a Catholic, but a different kind of Catholic, right? So that unitary control and authority and responsibility that the Catholic Church had developed in Europe during the period led to the opportunity for the church to deviate from its purported mission as a institution of salvation for the people of Europe and the people who prescribed Christianity. So what that meant is that first, people saw the influence the church had and saw a means to exploit it. And this happened at all levels of the church. There are even popes that exploited the influence of the Catholic Church for personal gain. There was a very famous cycle of popes, kind of led mostly by one named Borgia, who had many sons, was a busy boy, very corrupt, really focused on his own advancement and stuff like that. But then even at the local level, people would buy titles to become bishops. They wouldn't necessarily be the most read in Christianity to be leaders of the Christian community there. The other level to think about this is that the Catholic Church held a monopoly on Christianity and what it meant. That if someone came to a different conclusion in their own reading of Christianity, they were limited in what they could do with that. In fact, if they were to push it too much, their very lives could be put into danger. So even though there are people who are reading the Bible or reading the text of Catholic scholars and coming to new conclusions that deviate or challenge the orthodoxy of the Catholic Church, those people aren't really having any influence or also in danger for doing so. And the final thing is that the church had become a much more worldly institution. Its attachments to land ownership and its relationship with the centralizing states of Europe, like France, led to it to become an impartial, or a non-partial, actually, sorry, a non-partial, what I'm trying to say here, sorry. It became biased in how it upheld doctrine. So, for example, the Babylonian captivity is a period of time that the AMSCO emphasizes, in which the Catholic Church is actually moved out of Rome because of a political dispute occurring in Rome to the city of Avignon in France. And during that time, the French monarchy begins to exhibit a lot more authority and influence with the Catholic Church, which it was not that the French were more Catholic than anyone else, but because they could actually coerce the papacy to do things, they did so. So all of these issues are to contextualize what incites the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation can kind of be solely attributed to the initial work of a German monk named Martin Luther. There are people like in Bohemia who are challenging the Catholic Church before this, but Luther is the one who starts this Reformation we're going to talk about here. And he was a monk. So this is a person who was studying, I think he was studying to become a lawyer. And what that meant was you had to be studying a scholar of the Bible, because that was influenced all the laws and legal interpretations. And so Luther is having this experience, preparing to be a lawyer and becoming exposed to the Christian text. He's fluent in Latin. He comes to believe that many of the things the church does that are kind of accepted as what the church does are not aligned with biblical teaching. Two really important ones being the sale of indulgences and the practice of simony. Indulgences is the idea of, as an act of penance, you pay for your sins to be forgiven, where reconciliation and forgiveness of sins has been a part of Catholic doctrine since Catholic doctrine begins to get formalized. But to pay for forgiveness, just think about it like this: if you're very wealthy and a sin is $5, that sin doesn't really matter. You're not really learning why a sin is a bad thing. Where if you're a poor person, a $5 sin is that's a huge portion of your net worth, even though the same sin. So there's an inequality in the practice of indulgences that is not a tenet of a universalizing religion. Hypothetically, everyone has an equal chance at salvation according to Catholic doctrine and most Christian doctrines. Simony was the practice of the church selling offices like bishoprics or leaderships and clergies to the highest bidder. Someone would pay the church a fee, and that would make them a priest, which does not mean that the most effective priest is becoming the leader of a Catholic community. So in response to these, he nails 95 theses to a church, to a local church, and kind of one of the ultimate conclusions, and one of the conclusions that most distinguishes a Protestant from a Catholic in their doctrine, is the concept of sola fide. Sola fide is the concept of faith alone. So your belief in God and the idea that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah or the Son of God and will come again and save us from our sins and things like that, that belief is what makes you a Christian and what is the key to salvation, not doing things when you make a mistake and when you sin. And we can talk about that doctrine in a book talk probably, or if you have any questions about that, we can go deeper into that. I don't want this to get too long. And as a result of these 95 theses, these protests, the church gets mad. So some things happen because of Luther's actions that are not necessarily what Luther intended. Remember, this was a reform movement, that Luther wanted to change the church from within, not make a whole new sect of Christianity. So the first thing to think about is Martin Luther has some very clear, rational claims about the inappropriate behavior of the church. And there are states like rivals to France, rivals of the Papal States, who had disadvantageous relationships with the Catholic Church and seized upon the growing popularity of Martin Luther's ideas that become mass-produced as a consequence of the printing press to begin to advocate for leaving the Catholic Church and founding their own sects, okay? So now a lot of religion, a lot of states, specifically in central Germany that are a part of the Holy Roman Empire, decide to leave the Catholic Church and prescribe to Lutheranism or some of the many sects of Protestant Christianity that develop over the century after Luther's 95 Theses. There are many sects of Christianity that are defined as Protestantism. Amsco wants to highlight a very interesting one known as Calvinism. It becomes really significant, but always kind of has been interpreted as a relatively extreme or not radical sect, but like they have a very clear perspective on how the whole Christian things goes down. Okay. So John Calvin was a French theologian. When he's exposed to Luther's ideas, he builds upon them. He comes to his own conclusions. One of the most important things that is a part of the Reformation is that the Bible is finally published in the vernacular. And when the Bible is published in the local vernacular of languages, everyone now reads the Bible, and everyone now comes to new conclusions about what the Bible means and what Christianity means. And Calvin is just one of those people. So one of the interesting things that Calvin focuses on, and one of the conclusions he comes to when in his reading of the Bible, is the concept of predestination, in which that God, as an omnipotent being, an omniscient being, an all-knowing being, doesn't need us to do good works to find salvation. God knows who's going to heaven already. It's been predestined who's going to go to heaven already, and the people who were chosen to go to heaven are known as the elect. So Calvin believed like a very concrete number. I can't remember off the top of my head, but something in the realm of tens of thousands of people would be chosen to ascend to heaven before the second coming of Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, and stuff like that. Another fun fact about John Calvin and Calvinism is something when I read this in a 30 Years War book a few years ago, I was like, that is a really interesting conundrum, and I'm glad that someone had something to say about it. I don't know if you prescribe to Catholicism, but something about Catholics that's really important, one of the things that distinguishes them from other Christians, is the idea of a literal transfiguration, that in a service, a priest has the Eucharist or the host, and he performs a ritual, and that changes the unleavened bread into the literal body of Christ. That is the belief of Catholics, and they turn the wine into the literal blood of Christ. And John Calvin said that couldn't happen, mainly because that would mean that humans would be digesting the body of blood of Christ and have to turn it into excrement. And that's like, he couldn't abide turning the body of Christ into that stuff. And so he wouldn't accept that he said it was a symbolic transfiguration. So that's what you got to remember about John Calvin, if nothing else has stuck so far. Some really important people and sects to American history come out of the Calvinist movement. For example, Puritans who come to Massachusetts and the northeastern part of North America are Calvinist in doctrine. Those are the Pilgrims and things like that, which were going into Thanksgiving season. So connection there. And then another really interesting thing that Calvin begins to kind of set the foundation for is that Protestants and Europeans kind of have this innate cultural and social call to work harder than other groups of people. And I'm just kind of planting this seed for when we guys talk about the rationales for European imperialism, because that idea of something about Europeans being innately superior to others is going to show up when Europeans seek to explain why they end up conquering a vast majority of the area of the world. Part of them say, oh, it's because we're Protestant and we work hard. That's one of the ideas they have. That's kind of blatantly false. There were lazy Protestants. And the final Protestant sect we need to talk about is the Anglican Church. Uh, this is a great example of a political response to the Reformation. Those leaders that were in a disadvantageous relationship with the church take advantage of the instability caused by the Reformation to advance their own interest. So Henry VIII is a ruler in England. He's unhappy with Catholic supremacy. For example, the Catholic Church controls a great deal of territory in England because they control the church. He could use more Christian authority to prove that he should govern over people. And also, he's getting mad that his Catholic wife, I believe it's Catherine of Aragon. I should double check that right now, so let me pause. I was correct. I'm sorry I have not seen the musical Six. If I had, I would probably remember that more easily. But Henry VIII is mad at his Catholic wife, Catherine of Aragon, who is the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. And so he seeks to divorce her, but because the Catholic Church and Spain are buddy-buddy, they don't let him divorce it. But he's like, well, fine, I won't be a Catholic anymore. I'll make my own religion. I will seize all the Catholic land in England and put it under my control. And he makes a new church called the Anglican Church, and he marries Anne Boleyn, who is his bae, until she betrays him and he cuts off her head. And that's another character in the musical Six. That's an example of how the Protestant Reformation led to political consequences as well. There are other changes that occur as a consequence of state expansion and centralization of authority during the period. So, for example, in Russia, the Tsar begins to expand their control over the church until eventually they become the central leaders of the church itself, the Orthodox Church, right? So before Peter the Great, a Tsar had to calculate the Orthodox Church as guaranteeing their approval, which means giving them certain privileges and things like that. During Peter the Great's reign, because he's so effective at consolidating control under his singular interest, he's able to abolish the separate institution of patriarchy. Eventually, the Tsar becomes the symbolic patriarch or leader of the Catholic Church. And then he puts the entire Orthodox Church under governmental control by creating the Holy Synod, Synod, in which the ecclesiastical authorities that define orthodoxy and stuff like that and choose its leaders is overseen by a governmental official. And so what that means is that Peter the Great now has a monopoly on control of religion. And what he does with that is he's able to use the church to say that, God has chosen me to be your ruler. And the Tsar continues to be the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, or the leader of the Orthodox Church, until the Romanovs dynasty is deposed in the 20th century. Now, as a consequence of the Reformation itself, the Catholic Church notices and is aware that these problems are really too big to ignore. And so the counter-reformation were efforts by the Catholic Church to address some of these concerns. Some of them were to kind of destroy and break up any chance of another Reformation movement that wasn't Protestant, a new kind of Reformation movement. Others were actually meant to expand the membership of the church. And the final one was actually to address the actual legitimate concerns of the Protestant Reformation. I think the sun is getting out of this light is I'm not a fan of it. I'm going to move a little bit. So the Inquisition was established by the church to kind of look for places where a new Reformation kind of find the next Martin Luther and root him out or change his position. Now, kind of, I think you guys probably have some impression of the Spanish Inquisition or the Inquisition itself. And yeah, many people were tortured to death and stuff like that. But the broader goal, it wasn't always the case. The point of the Inquisition was to investigate reports of apostasy, which mean like non-adherence to the actual religion and things like that. And the idea would be keep everyone following the same kind of doctrine so that it doesn't get all fragmented and splintered anymore, which is kind of going to be really interesting when you think about what happens in America with all their interesting fragmented belief systems in regards to Christianity. So the Society of Jesus was another institution founded during the period, and their goal was to expand the faith. And the Jesuits ended up being some of the most effective, one of the more effective developments in the history of the Catholic Church, because they find a lot of success in bringing Christianity to not so much in Europe, but actually across the American colonies that Spain and Portugal are acquiring at the time. They also have success in India and Japan, and even some success in China as well. That these Jesuits, in a lot of ways, present Christianity in the chill way that Sufis present Islam. I would say that like Sufis are way more chill, but the methodology of meeting a person at their own level to present Christianity in a way that is palatable and understandable to them is something that the Society of Jesus was really effective at. And even today, the Jesuit order is really effective at that as well. The Council of Trent was the event that met over several periods of time to actually abolish things like indulgences, but also made sure it kind of kept the doctrine of the church more universal so that there would be less disagreement among interpretations of Christianity. And so the counter-reformation does not lead to a great deal of success in Europe, but they are essential to the penetration and expansion of Christianity in places like South America, French America, which is like North America, the Caribbean, as well as India and Japan, like I said already. And then just a final kind of challenge they face that the kind of shoves in here, even though it's not the best place to put it, is that the kind of central leader of the Catholic political system during the period is Charles V. Who is both the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which is based in Austria, centered in the Kingdom of Austria, but also the King of Spain. So Charles V controls probably the biggest states in Europe throughout this period of 1450 to 1750. And his failure to stop the spread of Protestantism leads to his abdication and the fragmentation of that line, such that Philip II becomes the King of Spain and Ferdinand becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. Philip II tries to carry on the mission of his father of fighting against the Protestant Reformation. He tries to invade the Netherlands. It goes very poorly because the Dutch are hardcore Protestants. They don't want to become Catholics. And in fact, during their civil war and resistance against the Spanish, they actually end up breaking the dams because Netherlands is below sea level and flooding parts of the country that even up until about 30 years ago were still submerged. So yeah, and then England he tries to invade England with the Spanish Armada. That goes terribly and kind of begins to highlight the importance of naval supremacy in British foreign policy and military strategy. So that is a counter-reformation. And so we have 3 more slides, but this is going to be the longest video of the week. So the other thing that happens as a consequence of the Reformation are these wars of religion. And the ultimate conclusion we need to come from these is that they're inconclusive in that neither side achieves a form of supremacy that means that one side is going to prevail over the other across Europe. What ends up happening is that there are areas of Catholic authority and areas of Protestant authority that end up realizing that to try to eradicate one another is not worth the investment of resources to do so, and so they don't. So the first kind of event that shows the inconclusivity of the Catholic-Protestant conflict is the Peace of Augsburg, which essentially was an agreement in the Holy Roman Empire, which is a really complicated political system that I'm thinking of the length of this video. I should not go any further into. Just that in a book talk, please ask your teacher to maybe go a little bit more in depth in the Holy Roman Empire and how it was an empire and it had a border, but it definitely was not like everyone was on the same page in the HRE. So the Peace of Augsburg essentially was an agreement between the Protestant rulers, and the Catholic leaders of the Holy Roman Empire to pretty much say, a principality can choose to be one Protestant or Catholic, and then everyone within those states must adhere to the state religion. Okay. So that's going to sound a lot like the Peace of Westphalia in a moment, and we'll talk about why these two need to be reiterated and things like that. France has a really interesting kind of circumstantial event that happens. The largest Protestant sect inside of France were called Huguenots. And eventually, the heir to the French throne is a Protestant. Now, France is a very Catholic country. Historically, have been very Catholic. You think about the Avignon Papacy, or what was called the Babylonian Captivity by Amsco. So France is majority Catholic. The dukes, the counts, all of the feudal system is Catholic, but this Protestant is in line for the throne. Henry IV chooses to convert to Catholicism, but when he converts to Catholicism, he issues what's called the Edict of Nantes, which is what permits a tolerance of the Huguenots within France. So that's kind of a really kind of unique event that the succession falls that way. I don't think Henry IV necessarily was planned, if I recall, planned to become the King of France. But then he converts out of pragmatics. He would not have been allowed to become the King of France if he was a Protestant. That is why he converted. And until the late 16th century, Huguenots are tolerated. Now, when Louis XIV comes to power, who, again, is this ruler who's able to consolidate a great deal of authority within France, he has the means to end that policy of tolerance without experiencing a civil war, because Huguenots did have a lot of economic influence because they had developed, a specific kind of control of the middle class or industries, and he actually ends up expelling all the Huguenots, and that harms the economy of France a smidge, but also France is doing so well at the time under Louis XIV, not for his grandson, Louis XIV, that it doesn't seem to impact their economy so much. The principal war of religion, and France has their own war of religion as well, but the principal war of religion to talk about would be the 30 Years' War. And what we could call it would be a civil war. That's a continental conflict. That it was a civil war, which is a war that occurs between two countries, or within one country, between multiple sides. But then so many groups are invested in the success of one side of the war over the other. Eventually, most nations in Europe, and including some states like the Ottoman Empire, get involved on one side or the other. So it becomes a continental conflict. It's particularly destructive because these people found this was a fight over the existence and perpetuation of their own religions. In order to maintain effective militaries, a lot of them used mercenaries who were paid in the looting and raiding of the areas they were fighting in. So there are a great deal of civilian casualties. About 8 million people die in the 30 Years' War, which is massive. To kind of put in perspective for you guys, the Civil War, which is the deadliest war in American history, leads to about 800,000 to 1 million casualties. Depending how you think about it, maybe a little bit more than that. And then this is a war 250 years before that leads to 8 million deaths, and only it's only 5 times as long as the Civil War. Eventually, the conflict is ended with the Peace of Westphalia. So, how you want to separate the Peace of Augsburg and the Peace of Westphalia is that the Peace of Westphalia is the end of the 30 Years' War. It is a reiteration of the Peace of Augsburg, but it is then expected to be adhered to because France and then a Protestant nation, Sweden, become enforcers of the treaty. And so, what you need to remember is just Augsburg, Westphalia, same concept that rulers can pick their own religion, but Westphalia is a recapitulation or reiteration of the Peace of Augsburg, but this time it's going to be listened to and followed. And then the principalities that make up it, mainly the Protestant principalities, get more autonomy than they had before, because before that, Austria was exerting a great deal of pressure on these Protestant nations to convert back to Catholicism. And now, after Westphalia, these nations are no longer experiencing that pressure. And so, what that leads to is states that are a part of the HRE are eventually going to become stronger than the nation that leads it, which is Austria, and that's going to eventually lead to its dissolution in many ways. Now, we're going to leave Europe now that we spent 20 minutes talking about 20 minutes, please say 20 minutes. 29 minutes talking about. And we're going to talk about Islam. So the Ottoman Empire also used religion. Now the Ottoman authority has more control over the Ottoman state. They were able to impose their own interpretations of Sharia law, which is a law that's influenced by the Quran. You learned about that at 1.2. The Safavids are really interesting because the nation of Arbil, which is the country or kingdom that became the Safavids, was a very, very tiny country. And if you kind of followed the story of humanity 100 times, Arbil becomes the leader of a massive empire in like 3 or 4 of those realities. It's a very kind of coincidental event in human history that this tiny country that's a kind of a peripheral sect of Islam, Shia Islam, specifically Twelver Shiism, becomes the leader of like Central European Islam, Central Asian Islam. And so when the Safavids come to power, they forcibly convert the Sunni Muslim population to Shia Islam. And that is why nations like Iraq and Iran are the only Sunni Shia majority Islamic nations in the world. The Mughals are really distinct because the Mughals aren't trying to make their countries more Muslim under Akbar's rule, who's kind of the first big leader of the Mughal Empire, because he explores a policy of tolerance. He ended the jizya, which was the head tax. He allowed Islam and Hinduism and even supported a newer religion of Sikhism, which was like a Hindu-inspired religion that had taken some of the methodology of Sufism, not the doctrine of Sufism. So it's not a Muslim Hindu syncretic religion. It's a Hinduish religion that is inspired by parts of Sufism, probably. It's a probably thing. Hindus worked with the Islamic leaders in the Mughal state, and eventually Akbar tried to convert people to his own religion that was syncretic of Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and Sikhism, but that's not very successful. And our final slide for this video, and this will be the longest video. The next video will be quite short. Is the scientific revolution that you want to kind of consider in the context of world history, science and empiricism as its own kind of belief system. If a belief system is a way that people try to explain the world around them, for some people, the way the world is the way that it is because God made it that way, and people kind of find rationales in that way. Empiricism uses human senses, observation to guide conclusions. They also develop methodologies like replicability, so everyone can test whether this truth is true or this conclusion can be supported by multiple different groups. And so empiricism, the idea that a thing about the world can be known through human observation, is pretty foundational to future developments in science, in politics, because abstract concepts like the divine right of kings don't hold up to empirical scrutiny and stuff like that. There are scientists that are really important to this movement. The states fund and support increased innovation, like Royal Academies of Science, like what they do in England. Isaac Newton develops calculus and gravity. Galileo makes observations about celestial bodies. Kepler also does the same thing. And the scientific revolution is going to be really significant when people start doubting the pre-existing modes of government and exploring new ways to be governed, which is going to lead to eventually democratic institutions in the era of Enlightenment revolutions that we're going to talk about in December and January. All right? So this is our first video, and probably the longest video we're going to have all year, because this chapter is so dense. And you'll see me in the next video, and that one should be about 7 minutes long. All right, see you in that video, guys. Bye.